So good morning, everyone. And on behalf of the Institute of Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, the Chennai Center for China Studies, and the Press Institute of India, this is Sashi Naya extending to all of you a very warm welcome. I'm particularly delighted to welcome Mr. Jayadev Ranade. Thank you, sir, for so readily agreeing to come to this program and to deliver the inaugural address. It's a pleasure having you. Sometime in 2013, at the Deccan Herald office in Bangalore, I had met Mr. Heblika and Professor Chengappa. And from that meeting, we set the ball rolling for programs on national security and foreign policy. The idea being to equip journalists with knowledge and skills to analyze and report better on some of these aspects. I must thank Mr. Shantakumar, our trustee, for making that introduction and for also helping us and advising us in the early days. From those days in 2013, the ISSB and PII have conducted several programs on national security and foreign policy. And along the way, I was also introduced to Mr. D.S. Rajan, who sadly is no more, and Commodore Seshadri Vasan, who over the years has become a very good friend and advisor, and a man who has always been supportive of our programs. And along these years, ICSB, C3S, and PII have forged a strong association, a strong bond. And we are very happy this morning to say, or at least I must say, on behalf of all three of us, that it is a pleasure to have been able to work together to put together this program. And this, incidentally, is the first of a series of programs that we have planned during this year, some of which will look at cybersecurity, at the media landscape in China, and also on maritime aspects relating to the Indian Ocean region. Why deciphering China? I don't think I need to give you a reason. For one, for journalists, it's a very topical subject. It's contemporary. There is no day where you don't see nothing written about China or about India-China relations. It's there all over the pages. And this is quite astonishing when you come to think of it, because we are in the midst of COVID crisis and a lot of other things. But China still, sort of hogs the limelight. Recent developments, as we all know, along the line of actual control between India and China indicate that there is a lot of tension. There is no doubt that relations have been strained, and there is also no doubt that there are mutual suspicions. There have even been talks of war. So there is uncertainty, a lot of tension, and the situation doesn't look like it's going to change in a hurry. So who better to set the ball rolling and to set the tone and tenor for this conference, the first, which is called Deciphering China. And I must thank Mr. Ranade once again for coming here. For journalists and for others who might be watching now and who might watch later, because we will have this on YouTube, the edited version. Mr. Jayadev Ranade is president of the Center for China Analysis and Strategy. He retired as Additional Secretary, Cabinet Secretariat, the Government of India in August 2008, and was later appointed a member of the National Security Advisory Board. He is a member of the core group on China of the Indian Council of World Affairs a distinguished fellow of the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies and distinguished fellow at the Center for Air Power Studies in New Delhi. Mr. Ranade has specialized for over 40 years in analyzing developments relating to China, Tibet, and East Asia, and his foreign assignments include Hong Kong, Beijing, and Washington, D.C. He has prepared and finalized briefs and analysis on issues of strategic importance for the highest echelons in government. Mr. Ranade obtained a diploma of advanced proficiency in Chinese from the Jawaharlal Nehru University and a certificate and diploma in Mandarin from the University of Hong Kong. He is author of the books China Unveiled, Insights into Chinese Strategic Thinking, which was released in January 2013, and Xi Jinping's China and Cadres of Tibet, both released in October 2017. He writes frequently in leading national newspapers and strategic and defense magazines, and is often requested to comment on national and international television channels. A pleasure to have you, Mr. Ranade. We look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Nair. And let me start by first thanking the Institute of Contemporary Studies, Bangalore, the C3S, and the Press Institute of India for calling me here, inviting me here, particularly Commodore Vasan, you, and of course, my good friend, Mr. Heblika. You have chosen a very apt title for today's times, which is Deciphering China. It's apt in two senses. One is, of course, in view of what's happening right now on our borders. And the second is how we should really start understanding China. Whether deciphering it first is important or understanding it is important, I leave it to you. But unless you know its intent, it's very difficult to understand what they are up to. I think, let me start by saying that to really decipher China, to decipher its intent, it is important really to have a cadre of people who have been watching it for a long, long time. Unlike studies of Pakistan or other countries, this is quite different. It's more complex. It requires a lot of reading between the lines. And I remember, I must mention, in the initial years when I had started out, after about 5 years of China watching, a friend of mine met me and he asked me, he said, Jaydev, how come you're not wearing any spectacles? So I said, I don't need it. He said, then you're not really doing China watching, because the characters are very small and there are reams and reams which you have to go through. Anyway, I managed it. But to understand what China is all about, it's not like other countries where some legislation is passed or a policy is announced. One has to understand the power equations within the Chinese Communist Party. One has to understand the alignments, who is who has been picked up by whom, and what their inclinations and thinking are. One has to understand what the thinking is within the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee, because that is the key. When we talk of China and how the Chinese think and how the Chinese feel, we are actually talking about the Chinese Communist Party and within it, the Central Committee, about 300 and odd members. But that's the lot who rules China. How do they communicate with their cadres who are spread out all across China, about 3,000 counties and villages? They communicate through the domestic media, which is why one needs to follow the domestic media. The provincial newspapers, the provincial television channels, and nowadays they all have websites, so the provincial websites. I'll give you an instance. In mid-August, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang had visited Chongqing, which is a centrally administered municipality, one of the largest in China, to look at the economic situation and the devastation caused by the floods. While there, of course, he made some speeches, visited some places. That was reported factually and briefly by the Chinese media. What they did not report was his purchasing some fried dough sticks, dough twists, and talking to the local shopkeepers and to the local merchants, saying how if more people had begun making things like this and selling them on the streets, the target of creating 9 million jobs would be far easier to meet. And he recommended that this be done. This was blanked out. Not only was it blanked out, Beijing News, in fact, criticized it. And they said it will make the streets dirty. People will be taking up this kind of business all over, and so did one or two others. By itself, one could ignore it, but actually this indicated a certain difference between different groups within the Central Committee, primarily between the Xi Jinping faction and Li Keqiang's, which persists. There is a feeling that Xi Jinping's grip is total. Yes, it is near total. But within the Politburo Standing Committee also, if you start looking at it closely, and the Politburo, there are signs of differences. I won't go into that now. But let me just say that all China today, a more assertive and progressively aggressive China, possibly even overconfident, it becomes even more important for us to see what's going on there and what their intentions are. The first signs of Deng Xiaoping's policy of lie low and bide your time was that it was being changed or jettisoned, came in the time of Hu Jintao. The Chinese president was Xi Jinping's predecessor. And he first started initiating a pushback by China on policies that it disapproved of. A couple of indicators were his approach towards the Dalai Lama. He began objecting and then pushing back and inflicting punitive punishments on countries that officially received the Dalai Lama or whose heads of state or government received him. Slowly, the number of visits that the Dalai Lama undertook abroad began coming down. This policy was accelerated and taken much further by Hu Jintao's successor, Xi Jinping, a man who thinks he is born to rule. He's a princeling, and he's a person whose background indicates that he wants to fulfill the ambitions of his forebears. That's his determination. And he took over, and unlike most leaders who tackle one problem area at a time, he seemed to have decided to tackle all of them. So he addressed problems, or what he thought were problems, in the three main pillars of the Chinese system: the party, the government, and the People's Liberation Army. Simultaneously, there are, I think, very few leaders who have done that, if any at all. As soon as he took over in November 2012, he summoned an enlarged meeting of the Central Military Commission. And the PLA in China, mind you, is the pillar. It's an army of the party. He summoned an enlarged meeting and he told them two things. Henceforth, absolute obedience to the party is a must. Secondly, political reliability will be the criteria for promotion. And subsequently, he began giving or restoring back more powers and authority to the political commissars who are integral to the People's Liberation Army. So that was the first move. The second was within the party itself. He undertook a rectification program. He told them that you guys are corrupt, you are not efficient, and he began instituting a rectification campaign in the party. The third was within the government, where again he undertook restructuring. The signal thing that he did was he reactivated the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, which is the party's anti-corruption watchdog body. And he put in charge of it his closest friend, Wang Qishan, as a financial administrator, in fact. He put him in charge and gave him the go-ahead. This anti-corruption campaign that Xi Jinping launched is probably the most thoroughgoing and the most long-lasting anti-corruption campaign that China has ever seen. There have been anti-corruption campaigns in the past, sporadic and primarily intended to meet immediate needs of weeding out opponents. But Xi Jinping has undertaken an even more thorough campaign. Just to give you an example, let us take September 2017, almost one term over. before he heads into the second term, which is the 19th Party Congress. By that time, he had got the PLA to accept the most far-reaching and extensive reforms that the PLA has ever seen. He did that by cajoling, by persuading, and by threatening. Over 150 PLA officers at the rank of Major General and above were dismissed. And in the Chinese system, dismissal means you lose everything. Not only your power and prestige, but all financial benefits that accrue to either you or your family. And 9 times out of 10, if you're found guilty of other charges, you're shot. Many people committed suicide so that their families at least would get the financial benefits. But I'm just giving you a number. How many were removed? In the party, over 175 people of the rank of Vice Minister and above, that is, in India's parlance, Secretary to the Government of India and above, were dismissed. In the government, again, a whole lot more. This was the manner in which the anti-corruption campaign actually created shockwaves in the system in China. It raised Xi Jinping's personal popularity. Along with this, he introduced a couple of other things. One was, he said, we must have a campaign against ostentatious living. And therefore, he mandated 1 soup and 4 dishes. It meant a loss of between 2 to 3% of the GDP. But he persisted. A lot of restaurants and shops had to close down because this culture of living off the iron bowl was being curbed. So this is what he began doing in the thing. But side by side, apart from these assertive moves, he also announced at the 18th Party Congress the China Dream. But let's cut to the more present times. Before that, what he did was in 2013, as soon as he entered the new year, he announced the Belt and Road Initiative. And that is where many people accepted it, or rather even propagated it as an economic venture. But if you read the writing on the wall at that time very carefully, what his loyalists said was, immediately after that, that China under Xi Jinping has now embarked on a new 30-year era, like those of Mao and Deng Xiaoping before him. The message was clear, that the Belt and Road Initiative was a strategic geo-economic initiative. It was meant for Chinese power, economic, military, and diplomatic to actually girdle the globe. And that is what, in essence, Xi Jinping's thinking was. It was to put China on the map. But let's cut to the current. At the 19th Party Congress in October 2017, Xi Jinping went a step further, and in a very bold move, what he announced were the China Dream again. It has 3 parts to it. The first is to make the Chinese people wealthy. The second, to make the Chinese nation prosperous. And the third, which is where the problem lies actually, was the rejuvenation or the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, which is actually recovery of all the territories that they feel were lost through the imposition of unequal treaties by hostile foreign powers. This is a key. The target date for achieving this was the 100th year of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which is 2021, next year. For us, it's an immediate concern. The second thing he announced was Made in China 2025, which is to make China or bring China to the level of the world's most advanced technology powers by 2025. And the final goal that he announced was to make China a major power with global pioneering influence by 2049, the 100th year of the founding of the People's Republic of China. This last actually means that China would then have the capability of either creating or influencing international organizations, something that only the United States has the capacity to do today. This was interpreted in the United States as being put on notice, as them being put on notice that China is now on the way to becoming a rival. Within China, some seasoned and senior Chinese cadres I happened to be visiting shortly after, in confidence, told me that we think we are now headed for difficult times. The move has been premature. And they said, look at the difference between the United States and China, which is true, which is why I use the term overconfidence. Let's just look at a couple of figures. The US per capita GDP is around 66,000 US dollars. The Chinese per capita GDP is around 9,500 US dollars. It's a vast difference. Their defense budget, the United States is around 1.3 trillion now. The Chinese is 178 billion. So there is a lot of difference. The net wealth of the United States is about $98 trillion. The net wealth of the Chinese is about $35 trillion. So when people talk about China overtaking the United States, or they're talking about trade volumes, which is one part of a country's national strength. So this is what China did. The US reacted, and we saw the onset or the beginning of the US-China trade war. And the US very correctly decided that to contain China's rise or to put a brake on China's rise, one has to actually tackle the technology sector, because that is the future. It is the future of growth actually of every country. And what they did was they picked up the so-called champions of Chinese high-tech industry, and they selected ZTE first. They targeted ZTE, virtually made it bankrupt. One doesn't hear of it today. Then they got after Huawei, the number one, the champion of the Chinese. You had the power of the state backing Huawei the moment it got into difficulty. There was a lot of bluff and bluster saying that we have the necessary wafers, we have the necessary imaging chips, we can manage, we can make it. But as of this month, the Chinese have stopped the manufacture. Huawei has stopped the manufacture of smartphones. They're in trouble, and Rang Changfei has said so. They're now trying other things, but the Americans are applying the squeeze. They have also told their allies, that is the South Korean and Taiwanese companies, who are the only two others who are making these high-tech chips, to stop supplies to China. This is going to have a cascading effect in other high-tech S&T areas of China, including space, because some of these parts are integral and they're only made in these countries. That's one aspect. But the second is the COVID crisis, which hit China. We may have our own views about COVID, but it led to a huge surge in anti-China sentiment around the world. That exists even today. As far as China itself is concerned, factories were shut down, restaurants closed, people were out of jobs, and an officially stated unemployment figure of between 17 to 20 million at the end of 2019 surged up to between 70 and 90 million by April 2020, thanks largely to COVID and reinforced by the US pressure, which had started giving problems to the Chinese economy. Here I must mention to you that the Chinese Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, a think tank like those of all of us, but it's a think tank of the Ministry of State Security, China's foreign intelligence arm. They briefed the Politburo and Xi Jinping in April this year, where they said essentially that anti-China sentiment is at an all-time high. Domestic discontent has spread and it is very high. The United States is very likely to set a spark to this and create social upheaval. There might even be social conflict. This was their warning. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, which is the largest think tank in China, a government think tank, they also made a similar assessment, and they also offered some suggestions of how to try and change the thinking in the United States. The PLA Daily, very unusually, published an editorial which said that the danger of social conflict domestically is very high, and the US is likely to set off a social conflict. So this was the mood in China at that time. There was a lot of articles as China began coming out of COVID that their industries had revived, that production had recommenced, etc. But the truth was otherwise. There is a prominent Chinese economist, Zhang Xiaonan, who in fact said that we will have no production, no wages, unless there are orders. Until the US and European markets recover, there will be no orders. So unemployment will come in, and be prepared for recession. This was the climate that exists. This is the climate that Xi Jinping had to face. But this came on top of something else, which was the political dissatisfaction in China. At the 19th Party Congress, he also not only ignored the age limits that had been set down by Deng Xiaoping for elevation of senior cadres, but he also abolished term limits on senior posts like that of president. There was a lot of discontent. Serving Central Committee party members, retired Central Committee party members protested. They said, we do not want a return to the one-man rule of Mao Zedong. Many of them, don't forget, had survived the Cultural Revolution. Some had somehow managed to retain their positions. Most had been consigned to the countryside and were rehabilitated by Deng Xiaoping. They did not want a return to those 10 tumultuous years of the Cultural Revolution. There was a lot of anti-Xi Jinping sentiment. Academics, prominent among them being very well-known Chinese academics like Xu Changrun, Xu Chiyu, Kai Xia, etc., wrote tracts which they posted on the Chinese internet, knowing full well that they will be identified and punished, but they took that risk. There were a plethora of a Supreme Court judge, I'm saying that a member of the Supreme People's Procuratorate, like a Supreme Court judge, also posted one on the internet. There were a number of such articles. And what was really surprising was, one, the people taking the risk to put it. Secondly, that these remained on the internet for a few days. Some of them, in fact, even continued for a month. So this was the scene that was there. The COVID came, the initial mishandling of the COVID saw a surge in this criticism. And for the first time in many, many years, at least for the first time that I have seen in my years of China watching, the incumbent General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, in this case Xi Jinping, was blamed by name and he was asked to step down. He was called a clown, etc. The princelings who normally keep quiet came out into the public and made their comments, again criticizing Xi Jinping. This was the scene that Xi Jinping faced, which is why there is an uncertainty about where China is headed, in addition to all the pressures that are there. But Xi Jinping, as I told you earlier, is a different kind of a person, a different kettle of fish. He's a man who saw his father being purged on 3 occasions, and therefore he lost everything. He saw his mother being humiliated in front of his eyes. He saw his elder sister being killed by the Red Guards. He himself was punished, and yet, unlike his schoolmates, he chose to join the Chinese Communist Party. The others either went abroad using their parents' influence or joined state-owned enterprises, something like our PSUs, for better jobs. But he chose to join the Chinese Communist Party. He had no protector, but he joined and he rose through the ranks till Deng Xiaoping, I would say, rehabilitated his father and things became better for him. But this is the kind of man who's there, and he fought back. Till today, there are 6 ideological campaigns that he has unleashed, covering virtually every sector. And he has also targeted the security apparatus, because he would have noticed that these posts, these offensive posts, remained on the internet for days on end, whereas the boast of the cyber administration of China is that they can remove it within a space of 5 minutes. Obviously, someone has to pay a price. So there is a massive rectification campaign going on there. Every day in the Chinese media, we find criticism of the United States. So Xi Jinping, I would say, is fighting back. But a lot depends on what kind of pressure and how much the United States keeps applying on China. They have started targeting the Chinese Communist Party. The first shock they gave was when they said they will sanction those members of the party who are instrumental in formulating or implementing policies that repress the local people. They have already targeted a few. Carrie Lam's son, the chief executive of Hong Kong, her son who was pursuing doctoral studies in Boston at Harvard, had to quit and come back. That was one. The second, Pompeo floated a proposal saying that members of the Chinese Communist Party may not be given a US visa. There were shockwaves in the Chinese Communist Party. Those shockwaves came out into the social media also, because 70% of the Chinese Communist Party cadres who are departmental heads and above, their children are studying in the United States. Obviously, they have money there to keep their children in college. They have relatives there. All that suddenly becomes vulnerable. Xi Jinping's position today is shaky, but as I said, he's fighting back. The reports that I get indicate that his security has been beefed up, but a lot depends on how China's economy recovers, on how much pressure the United States keeps on him. And as far as we are concerned on the border, and I'll conclude with this, on the border, if we stand up to the Chinese, it will be a setback for Xi Jinping, because he has to go home with a victory, something he can show. And for us, the stakes are equally high. If we give in, we would have lost a lot of prestige that we have gained in recent times. So I'll conclude here, and thank you very much once again for inviting me.